The bus rattled through a road that looked half forgotten by time. The windows were smudged with dust, the kind that blurred everything outside into vague shapes of trees, sky, and distant shadows that refused to stay still. I remember pressing my forehead against the glass, counting the turns, trying to convince myself that I was just going on a short trip, a few weeks of peace, maybe even boredom. But there was something in the air that didn't feel right. Something in the way my father avoided my eyes that morning. Something in the way my mother's hug lingered a little too long, her voice trembling when she said, "You'll be fine." The moment the bus pulled away, it felt like the world had shifted. I didn't know it then, but this wasn't a holiday. It was a sentence, one wrapped in politeness, tied with a smile. My uncle lived far from the city, in a house that sat too quietly at the edge of the woods, where the nights whispered and the walls remembered. He was the kind of man people spoke of in low tones, the kind whose presence demanded silence even when he wasn't in the room. I thought I was going there to rest, to breathe, to escape the noise of home. But sometimes distance doesn't heal, it exposes. And that house, with its locked doors and hollow hallways, was about to reveal things my parents never told me. And things I wish I'd never found. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe, not just to join the story, but to step inside it. Like this video if you've ever felt that strange, heavy intuition that something wasn't as it seemed. Because what you're about to hear isn't just my story, it's a reminder of how easily safety can disguise itself as kindness, and how one summer can change everything. The car that picked me up from the bus stop was old enough to groan every time it turned a corner. My uncle didn't speak much during the drive, and I didn't ask questions. His hands, large and veined, gripped the steering wheel like he was holding back something heavy. Not anger exactly, but a kind of restraint, as if silence was safer than words. The fields rolled past in long, uneven stretches, the kind that made you lose sense of direction. I remember thinking the landscape looked untouched by clocks, too still, too patient. When we finally turned down the dirt path leading to his house, the trees leaned in like they were guarding something. The first glimpse of the house made my stomach tighten. It wasn't ruined, but it wasn't alive either. The paint was pale and flaking, the windows slightly crooked, and the porch sagged under the weight of years. Yet there was a strange symmetry to it, like decay had decided to preserve its beauty out of respect. The front door opened before we reached it, and I swear I didn't see him turn the key. Inside, the air felt thick, not from dust or dampness, but from a silence that didn't belong to any normal home. It pressed against my skin, made every sound, footsteps, breath, heartbeat, feel too loud. My uncle gave me a room upstairs, across from a door that was always locked. He said it was the attic. "Old junk," he muttered, though the way his eyes lingered on the door made me wonder if junk was really the problem. The hallway smelled faintly of pine and something else. Something metallic, maybe rust, maybe blood. I unpacked slowly, feeling watched though I was alone. The walls were lined with old photographs, faces I didn't recognize, and yet one of them, a young woman standing near the porch, looked oddly like my mother. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that family resemblances ran deep. Still, I turned her picture to face the wall before I slept that night. The first night in that house was long. The sounds were too deliberate, too intentional to be the wind. Creaks where no one walked. A door sighing shut somewhere downstairs. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps pacing just outside my room, slow and heavy, pausing by the locked attic door. I held my breath until the floorboards stopped moaning. The silence afterward was worse, like the house had drawn in a deep breath and was holding it with me. I wanted to call my parents, to tell them something felt wrong, but when I checked my phone, there was no signal. Just an empty screen staring back. The days that followed blurred into a kind of quiet routine. My uncle rose before sunrise, worked in his study most of the day, and rarely ate with me. When he did, he spoke in half answers, his gaze always slightly off, as though he was talking to someone behind me. Once I found him standing in the backyard, looking at nothing for what felt like minutes. I asked if he was okay. He blinked, smiled faintly, and said, "The woods remember everything. You just have to listen." I didn't know what he meant then, but the words would come back later, like an echo I couldn't escape. By the third day, I started noticing strange inconsistencies in the house. A picture frame moved half an inch overnight. A light bulb that had burned out flickered back to life. Once, I left my notebook on the desk and found it open the next morning, a faint smudge of dirt on the page, as if someone had touched it with unwashed hands. My uncle denied coming into my room. His expression didn't change when I confronted him, but his eyes, they flinched just for a second. "Some houses don't like being questioned," he said, turning back to his breakfast. I laughed softly, pretending not to feel the chill his words left behind. One evening, the sun dipped low enough to spill blood-orange light through the hallway. I stood outside the locked attic door, listening. For a moment, I could have sworn I heard something. Not movement exactly, but breathing. Slow, strained, human. I stepped closer, pressing my ear to the wood. The sound stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so sharp it made my heart hammer. I stepped back, my hand trembling on the doorknob, half expecting it to turn on its own. But it didn't. The stillness that followed felt almost deliberate, like whatever was behind that door had just decided to wait. That night, I dreamed of the house itself. In the dream, the walls pulsed faintly, as though alive, and the floorboards whispered my name. When I woke, I wasn't sure if I had truly been asleep. My window was open, the curtain fluttering in a breeze that carried the faint smell of smoke. Somewhere outside, a single light flickered in the trees, too far to be a lantern, too steady to be fireflies. I watched it until dawn, my pulse matching the rhythm of the house's slow, steady breaths, and though I told myself I was imagining things, deep down, I knew. That house wasn't just shelter. It was a living thing, and it was waiting for me to understand what it wanted. By the end of the first week, the house had learned the sound of my footsteps. I could feel it. Each creak beneath my soles felt like acknowledgement, like a slow turn of attention. My uncle, meanwhile, seemed both present and absent, his movements deliberate but disconnected, as if he existed in two places at once. The air between us was always heavy, filled with unsaid things that neither of us dared to speak. He'd spend hours locked in his study, a narrow room with the door always slightly ajar, light spilling out in a thin golden stripe that cut across the hallway. I once passed by and caught the faint sound of murmuring. When I leaned closer, I realized he was talking, but not to anyone I could hear. The first dinner we shared after days of silence felt staged, like we were actors performing for someone unseen. The dining room smelled faintly of wood polish and old wine. The long table was too grand for two people, its dark surface reflecting the flicker of candlelight that trembled with every breath we took. My uncle sat at the far end, slicing his food with surgical precision. His plate looked untouched no matter how much he cut. Between us lay the kind of silence that hums just below hearing, like the low note of a cello, deep and endless. He finally broke it. "Your parents must miss you," he said, eyes fixed on his knife. His tone was gentle, but there was an odd hesitation there, as if he was unsure what the right answer should be. "I think so," I said carefully. "They don't call much," he nodded once. "They're busy people." "Always were." He smiled faintly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Then almost absently, he added, "Still, it's strange, isn't it? How distance makes us remember the wrong things first." I didn't know what to say to that. The clock on the wall ticked unevenly, like it was missing beats. A fly buzzed near the candles, but never landed. When I reached for my glass, I noticed faint scratches on the table's surface, lines etched in patterns, like someone had carved initials, then tried to scrape them away. I ran my finger over them, and the wood felt warm, almost like skin. My uncle's gaze flickered up for just a second, sharp and knowing. "Best not to touch things that don't belong to you," he said softly, and his voice, though calm, carried a weight that made me freeze. The meal continued in strained silence. Every sound, the clink of a fork, the slow pour of wine, the hiss of candle wax, felt amplified. When I looked up again, he wasn't eating anymore. He was watching me, not with suspicion, but with something else, something closer to recognition. "You look like her," he said after a while, his voice almost a whisper. "The same eyes." "Like who?" I asked, though I already feared the answer. He looked down, exhaled slowly. "No one you'd remember." The next morning, I found the dining room exactly as we'd left it, except the plates were spotless, the candles replaced, and the scratches on the table were gone. Not sanded down or covered up? Gone, like they'd never existed. The air smelled faintly of smoke again, the same scent that drifted through my window that first night. I followed it through the hall until it faded near the attic door. For the first time, I noticed something new, a keyhole faintly glinting in the light. And behind it, the sound of movement. Soft, like fabric brushing against wood. That evening, dinner was different. My uncle seemed lighter, almost cheerful. He poured me a glass of wine, which I refused. He chuckled. "Afraid I'll poison you?" I smiled awkwardly, unsure whether it was a joke. The candlelight flickered higher than before, casting shadows that stretched long and thin across the walls. His expression shifted as he spoke about my father, how they'd grown up together, how they'd drifted apart. "He never told you about this place, did he?" he asked. I shook my head. "Of course not." He wanted to forget. He leaned back, eyes narrowing, and for a moment the air around him seemed to tighten. "But forgetting," he said, "is just another kind of remembering. You can bury a memory, but the roots always find their way to the surface." I didn't sleep much that night. The house seemed louder after dark, as though the dinner conversation had awakened something. Doors creaked open when no one touched them. The hum of the refrigerator turned into a low, rhythmic sound that almost resembled breathing. Around midnight, I heard a faint scratching, steady, deliberate, coming from above my room. The attic. It stopped whenever I moved, then started again once I went still. I sat there for hours, staring at the ceiling, every nerve alive with dread. When I finally drifted into a half-sleep, I dreamt of the dining room. The table was longer, stretching endlessly into the dark, with chairs on both sides filled by shadowed figures whose faces I couldn't see. My uncle sat at the head smiling, and beside him was a woman with my mother's hair but eyes that didn't belong to her. She turned to me and whispered something I couldn't understand, her lips forming shapes that felt familiar, almost my name. When I woke, my mouth was dry, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. The next morning, I found a folded napkin on my plate at breakfast, though we hadn't eaten yet. Inside, written in hurried handwriting, were 3 words. "Don't trust him." The ink was smudged, the paper creased like it had been handled too many times. I looked toward the study where the door was closed as always. The house around me felt suddenly smaller, the walls closer. And for the first time, I realized I might not be the only one here who was afraid. For 2 days, I carried that napkin folded in my pocket like a secret heartbeat. I couldn't stop wondering who had written it, or when. The handwriting wasn't my uncle's. It was smaller, uncertain, like someone who had learned to write by candlelight, hurriedly, under pressure. I examined it until the paper began to tear along the folds. Each time I thought about throwing it away, something in me resisted. It felt like a message meant to reach me long before I arrived. The attic key appeared on the morning of the 3rd day. I found it lying on my windowsill, perfectly centered, its brass edges cold despite the sunlight streaming in. I stared at it for a long time before touching it. The key looked old but well kept, the kind of thing that didn't rust easily. My uncle had left for town earlier, muttering something about errands. It was the first time I'd been alone in the house. Truly alone. The silence was heavier than before, but also inviting, like the house had been waiting for this exact moment. I walked down the hall, each step echoing too loudly. The attic door stood ahead, that same faint smell of metal lingering near it. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the lock. It turned smoother than I expected, like it had been used recently. The door opened inward, and a wave of stale air rolled out, thick with dust and something older, something like smoke and paper. The light from the hallway didn't reach far. The darkness seemed to swallow it whole. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak like a warning. The attic was larger than it looked from below. The ceiling slanted sharply, beams crossing overhead like ribs. Old trunks were stacked in corners, covered by sheets that billowed slightly in the draft. I stood still for a moment, listening. There it was again, the breathing I had heard that first night. Only now it was faint, rhythmic, almost comforting, like the sound of the house itself inhaling and exhaling. I moved toward the far end, where a shaft of light fell through a narrow window. On a small table, half buried beneath yellowed papers, lay a bundle tied with string. The papers were letters, their ink faded but still legible. The top one was addressed in looping handwriting, for Elias. That was my father's name. My throat tightened as I unfolded it. The letter wasn't dated, but the handwriting was delicate, almost trembling. My dearest Elias, you were right. The house remembers everything. I tried to leave, but it doesn't let go so easily. Your brother thinks it belongs to him now, but he doesn't understand. It belongs to the one who listens. If you ever come back, don't bring the child. Promise me you won't bring the child. The rest of the page was torn. I read the letter again and again, trying to make sense of the words. Your brother, my uncle. My hands shook. I shuffled through the stack and found more letters, some signed only with initials, others unfinished. Each hinted at something hidden in the house, something that bound my father and uncle in silence. One mentioned the room beneath the floorboards. Another spoke of a promise broken. I didn't hear the footsteps at first. They were soft, careful, climbing the stairs behind me. I turned, and there he was, my uncle standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The light caught the edge of his face, half in shadow. You shouldn't be up here, he said quietly. I froze, the letters still in my hands. You left the key. He tilted his head slightly. Did I? For a long moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt electric, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm. Then, almost gently, he stepped closer. There are things in this house, he said, his voice low and deliberate, that don't like to be disturbed. Some doors are better left closed, I swallowed hard. What happened here? He looked past me, toward the window, where dust floated like pale ash. Your father forgot who he was, he said, and forgetting can be dangerous. He turned and walked back down the stairs, leaving the door open behind him. I stood there, heart pounding, the letter still open in my hand. For the first time, I felt the house react, not in sound, but in temperature. The air grew colder, as if my discovery had shifted something deep within its bones. The floorboards beneath me groaned softly, almost like a sigh. I folded the letters carefully and hid them under my shirt. As I stepped back into the hallway, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass frame opposite the door. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing behind me. A woman's figure, faint and translucent, her face turned toward the attic. But when I looked back, there was nothing there. Only the still air and the faint smell of smoke. That night, I read the letter again by candlelight, tracing each word as though it might change beneath my fingers. Don't bring the child. The phrase circled in my mind like a whisper. I was the child, and my father had broken the promise. When the candle burned low, I thought I heard the faintest voice drifting through the vents, soft and trembling, like a lullaby half forgotten. I leaned closer to the wall, listening. He knows you're here. The flame flickered violently, then went out, and in the sudden dark, the house exhaled, long, slow, and alive. The next morning, sunlight struggled to enter the house, as if even the day had begun to distrust it. I walked through the halls with the letters pressed against my chest beneath my shirt, their edges scratching faintly against my skin. My uncle was nowhere to be found. His car was gone, and the silence that replaced him wasn't comforting. It was alert, listening, waiting for me to make a mistake. Every floorboard moaned under my steps. Every door hinge groaned as though the house was whispering its disapproval. But something inside me had shifted. The fear was still there, but now it carried a thread of resolve. I needed to know what this place was hiding. The line from the letter, the room beneath the floorboards, wouldn't leave my mind. It looped endlessly, like a quiet hum beneath everything I did. I started in the study. The smell of old paper and faint smoke lingered, and the desk was cluttered with books whose pages had gone soft with age. Most were journals written by my uncle. The handwriting was his, but the tone wasn't. The words grew stranger the deeper I read. Phrases like "the house keeps count," "the walls remember names," "Elias won't listen." Each sentence seemed to circle the same obsession, that the house was alive, that it fed on memory, that forgetting was the only mercy it offered. The floor beneath the desk had a different texture when I stepped on it, more hollow, more fragile. I crouched down, running my hand across the boards until I found a seam slightly wider than the rest. It didn't look like a trapdoor, just an uneven patch. But when I pressed my palm flat against it, I felt the faintest draft rise through the cracks. There was space beneath. I fetched a screwdriver from the kitchen and began prying at the boards. The wood groaned, reluctant, as though it didn't want to be moved. When the first board came loose, a rush of cold air escaped, carrying the smell of earth and iron. I pulled away 3 more planks until I could see a narrow gap leading downward, into darkness. My pulse thudded in my ears. I lit a candle, the wax dripping onto my fingers as I leaned closer. The space below wasn't deep, maybe 6 feet, but what I saw there made my stomach twist. There were boxes stacked neatly in rows. Not the random clutter of storage, but careful arrangement. Inside the first box lay old toys, wooden blocks, a doll missing one glass eye, a tiny shoe that couldn't have belonged to anyone older than 6. The second box held letters, hundreds of them, tied in the same twine as the one I'd found in the attic. Some were unopened, and beneath them a photograph, faded, grainy, but unmistakable. My father, my uncle, and a woman I didn't recognize. They stood in front of this very house, smiling. But behind them, in the window, was a shadow that didn't belong to any of them. My hands shook as I reached for another box, heavier than the rest. Inside were cassette tapes, each labeled with a date and a single word: voice, laughter, screaming, silence. The latest one was from the year I was born. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the rough texture of dried adhesive as if it had been handled too many times. There was an old tape player on a shelf nearby, half covered in dust. I slid the tape in, pressed play, and for a moment, nothing happened, just the soft hiss of static. Then faintly, my father's voice. "If anyone hears this." The house isn't just remembering, it's learning. It takes what you hide, what you refuse to say. Don't let it hear you. Don't. The recording cut off abruptly, replaced by a sound I couldn't place, like wind forced through narrow lungs. I turned off the player, my hands trembling. That was when I noticed the candle flame bending sharply to one side. Not flickering, bending, as if something unseen was breathing inches from it. The air in the crawl space began to change, the temperature dropping so quickly that my breath came out in small clouds. The shadows on the walls stretched longer than they should have, pooling around the edges of the hole. I scrambled backward, but before I could replace the boards, I heard a soft sound, fingers tapping against wood, coming from beneath me. 1, 2, 3. A pause. Then again, closer. I slammed the planks back into place, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't care about neatness. I just wanted the sound to stop. When I finally stumbled to my feet, sweat mixed with dust on my skin. The house was utterly still, but that stillness felt wrong, like the moment between lightning and thunder. I staggered into the hallway, gasping for breath, and nearly collided with my uncle. He looked at me, eyes calm, expression unreadable. "You opened it," he said quietly. I couldn't speak. My throat felt dry, my voice caught somewhere between panic and disbelief. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I told your father it wouldn't stay buried. I told him the house remembers what we forget. What is it? I managed to ask. "What's under there?" He looked up, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not anger, not madness, but fear. "Our past," he whispered. "And it's awake now." That night, the house didn't pretend anymore. Every board groaned like it was speaking in pain. The walls throbbed faintly, and the pictures in the hallway rattled against the plaster. I locked my door, but even then I could hear the faint tapping from beneath the floor. 3 taps, then silence. 3 taps, then silence. The same pattern, steady as a heartbeat. When I finally dared to look under the bed, I found dust and old wood and a single piece of paper. A torn fragment of a letter, written in the same trembling hand I'd seen before. It knows the child now. I pressed my back against the wall, my mind racing. I didn't know whether it meant my father's child or me, but I understood one thing with awful clarity. Whatever was buried beneath this house wasn't done with us. Not yet. The next morning arrived without sunlight. The world outside the window had turned the color of ash, and the trees leaned toward the house like they were listening. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flicker of that tape recorder light, heard the tapping beneath the floorboards echoing like a second heartbeat. My uncle's words from the night before lingered in my head. Our past. And it's awake now. There was no comfort in daylight anymore. The house had devoured the difference between night and day. I packed my things before breakfast. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like instinct, the body acting before the mind could interfere. I told myself I would walk down the dirt road until I found a signal, call my parents, tell them everything. But deep down I already knew they wouldn't answer. People who hide truths this large never do. As I zipped the last of my bag, I heard movement downstairs. Slow, deliberate, and heavier than my uncle's usual steps. I listened closely. The rhythm was uneven, like someone dragging their feet. When I reached the staircase, the house was dim except for a weak glow bleeding in through the curtains. My uncle stood by the front door, staring out into the woods. His posture was rigid, hands clasped behind his back like he was afraid they might shake. "You're leaving," he said, not turning around. "Yes." My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. He nodded once, as though he had expected it. "The house won't like that." I almost laughed. Almost. But something in his tone stopped me. "It's a house," I said, though it felt like a lie even as I said it. He turned then, and there was something strange in his eyes. Not anger, not sadness, but resignation. "You still think it's just wood and brick?" he whispered. "You've heard it breathe. You've seen how it listens. You think walls hold secrets?" "No, secrets hold walls." He stepped aside and opened the door. The woods beyond were gray, dense, and unmoving. "If you go," he said, "don't look back. No matter what you hear." I walked past him without answering. The air outside was colder than it should have been for summer. The dirt road stretched ahead, but the trees on both sides seemed closer than I remembered, their branches twisted like arms reaching out. I walked fast, then faster until I could no longer see the house. The silence here was wrong. Not empty, but full, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then came the first sound, a single, soft thud, like a knock against the ground. I stopped. Another thud followed, then another. Footsteps, behind me, slow, heavy in rhythm with mine. I didn't turn around. I remembered what my uncle said. "Don't look back." The footsteps grew closer, the crunch of gravel steady and patient. I began to run. The road curved through the trees, each turn feeling identical to the last, and the sky above was a pale, suffocating gray. When I finally risked a glance behind me, the path was empty. No figure, no movement, but the woods had changed. The trees now leaned inward, branches knitting together overhead until they blocked out the sky. I spun around. The road ahead had vanished, swallowed by roots and shadow. That's when I saw it. A faint light flickering deeper in the forest, the same steady glow I'd seen from my window that first night. It pulsed like a heartbeat calling. Against every instinct screaming inside me, I followed it. The ground grew soft, muddy, as though I was walking over something half buried. The light led me to a small clearing where the soil was disturbed, freshly turned. My pulse quickened. Kneeling, I brushed the dirt aside until my fingers hit something solid. Wood. A box, small, rectangular. I pried it open. Inside was another tape, newer than the rest. The label read only one word: return. I didn't have a player, but I didn't need one. The moment I touched it, a whisper filled my ears, faint but unmistakable. You can't leave what remembers you. I stumbled back, the box slipping from my hands. The woods shuddered, a low groan rippling through the ground. The trees began to sway, though there was no wind. From somewhere far behind me, I heard my uncle's voice, distant but clear, calling my name, pleading, almost breaking. Then beneath his voice, another. My mother's. Softer, sadder, the same tone she'd used the morning I left. You'll be fine. The light flickered out. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness and the sound of my own heartbeat. Then I saw it, the house. It was standing there at the edge of the clearing, impossibly close, its windows lit from within, though no one had lit a fire. It shouldn't have been there. I had walked miles away. But there it was, waiting. Something in me gave way. I didn't run this time. I walked toward it, drawn by a pull too old to resist. The front door creaked open before I reached it, and my uncle stood inside, his face pale and wet with tears. I told you not to look back, he whispered. I stepped past him. The house seemed different now, alive, awake. The walls trembled faintly with a pulse that matched my own. I could hear whispers in every corner, overlapping voices speaking my name in tones of love and warning. My uncle reached for me, but I was already moving toward the study. I knew what I needed to do. The boards I had pried up before were gone, replaced perfectly, no seams visible. I dropped to my knees, pressing my ear to the floor. The tapping returned. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats, like an invitation. Without hesitation, I began to tear at the floor with my hands. Splinters bit into my fingers, blood smearing across the boards. When the first plank came loose, the air beneath shimmered with heat. I could see shapes below, shadows moving against other shadows. My uncle shouted behind me, but I couldn't stop. I reached into the darkness, feeling for the edges of what was beneath. My fingers brushed against something cold and soft, not wood, not fabric, flesh. Then, the whisper again, but this time from everywhere at once. Now you remember. The floorboards gave way completely, and the room filled with a wind that howled without air. My uncle's scream tore through it, sharp and human, before vanishing into the noise. The candle on the desk burst, scattering flame and wax, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was outside. The house was gone. In its place was a patch of blackened earth, still warm beneath my palms. The woods were still again. No wind, no whispers. The world felt too quiet, as if it had exhaled its last breath. I stood, shaking, and turned toward the road. Behind me, from somewhere deep among the trees, came a single sound. 3 soft knocks, slow and deliberate. Then nothing. I didn't look back. I kept walking until the trees thinned and the first shape of the bus stop appeared in the distance. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel it. The breath of the house, faint and steady, somewhere behind me. Waiting.